My youngest son, Joseph, who's an airline pilot, called me. "Mom, something weird is going on. Is my daughter-in-law at the house?" "Yes," I answered. "She's in the shower." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's impossible because I'm holding her passport in my hands. She just boarded my flight to Paris." At that moment, I heard footsteps behind me. Laura's soft voice reached my ears. "Mom, I'm done with my shower." The phone felt heavy in my hand. My heart skipped several beats as I forced a smile, careful not to betray the earthquake that had just shattered my understanding of my own home. I quickly ended the call with Joseph, promising to explain later, though I had no explanations myself. How could Laura be on a plane to Paris when she was right here in our Chicago home, her hair still dripping water onto the hardwood floors I'd polished just yesterday? I'm Margaret Thompson, a 65-year-old widow living in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. My husband Robert passed away 10 years ago, leaving me with 2 sons I love more than my own life. Richard, my oldest, is a hard-working architect, often buried in blueprints and projects. Joseph, my youngest, made his childhood dream come true by becoming an airline pilot. My life revolves around Richard's small family, my daughter-in-law Laura, my grandson Ethan, and the quiet rhythms of this house. The morning had begun like any other. Richard left early for work, kissing my cheek and reminding me of his late meeting. 7-year-old Ethan, that clever little devil, had already been picked up by the school bus, his Batman lunchbox clutched tightly in his small hands. And Laura had just gone upstairs, her voice trailing behind her. "Mom, I'm going to take a quick shower, okay?" I had just finished putting away the last breakfast plate when Joseph called. Now looking at Laura descending the stairs in her white bathrobe, toweling her dark hair, I felt like I was seeing a ghost. Or perhaps worse, a perfect stranger wearing the face of someone I thought I knew. "Who's on the phone?" Laura smiled, her expression innocent and open as always. "Oh, just a friend of mine." I tucked the phone into my pocket, my hands trembling slightly. "Just catching up on neighborhood gossip." Laura nodded, seemingly accepting my explanation, and headed to the kitchen to pour herself some coffee. I watched her movements, the way she reached for the sugar with her right hand stirred twice clockwise, then lifted the cup to her lips. Movements I'd observed hundreds of times before now, laden with unspoken questions. I excused myself and went to my bedroom, closing the door before pulling out my phone again. I dialed Joseph back, my heart thundering in my chest. "Mom, I swear I'm not crazy." Joseph's voice was low, urgent. I literally just walked through first class to double-check. It's definitely Laura. She's sitting next to some rich-looking guy in an expensive suit. They're acting intimate, like a couple. A chill ran down my spine. I'd raised my boys to be honest, reliable men. Joseph had no reason to make up such an outlandish story. And yet Laura was downstairs at this very moment, sipping coffee in our kitchen. Are you absolutely certain it's her? Could it be someone who just looks similar? "Mom, I'm holding her passport." Her name. Her picture. She looked right at me when I passed by. Didn't even recognize me. Or pretended not to. I sank onto my bed, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. Somewhere between Chicago and Paris, between my kitchen and the first-class cabin of an international flight, reality had split in two, and I was caught in the fissure, unable to reconcile these contradictory truths. After ending the call, I sat in silence for several minutes, my mind racing. I've always been a practical woman. Robert used to say I could organize a hurricane if given the chance. I needed evidence, facts, a systematic approach to this impossibility. I pulled out an old leather-bound notebook from my nightstand drawer. It had been my companion during my years as an accountant before retirement, a career few in my family acknowledged anymore, seeing me primarily as the helpful grandmother and mother-in-law who kept the household running. The notebook's pages were lined and pristine, waiting for entries. I wrote the date at the top of the first page, then added Laura leaves for shower at 8:17 a.m. Joseph calls at 8:25 a.m., reports Laura on flight to Paris. Laura appears after shower at 8:30 a.m. The clinical precision of recording these events brought a small measure of calm. Facts don't lie. Something wasn't adding up, and I would get to the bottom of it. Over the next few days, I began cataloging Laura's behavior with the meticulous attention I once devoted to balancing complex financial ledgers. I noted how on Monday she prepared Ethan's favorite peanut butter and banana sandwich, cutting off the crusts and arranging it just so. But on Tuesday snapped at him for spilling a few drops of milk, her voice sharp and unfamiliar. On Wednesday, she wrote the grocery list with her right hand, her handwriting neat and contained. On Thursday, she scribbled a note for Richard with her left hand, the letters sprawling and uneven. I'm not losing my mind, I told myself as I documented these inconsistencies. There's a pattern here, a discrepancy that goes beyond mood swings or stress. The following weekend, I took Ethan to the neighborhood park, pushing him on the swings as he chattered about his school project. Suddenly he grew quiet, his small face pensive. Grandma, my friend Jake's mom, always remembers to pack him a juice box, but my mom forgot yesterday. And she never forgets. She remembered on Monday and Wednesday, but not Tuesday or Thursday or Friday. I tried to keep my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened. Tell me more about that, sweetheart. Ethan kicked his legs, soaring higher on the swing. Monday, Mom sings me the Sunshine Song at bedtime. But Thursday, Mom said she doesn't know that song. How can she forget our special song, the Sunshine Song, You Are My Sunshine? Was a lullaby I'd taught Laura when Ethan was just a baby. She'd never missed singing it to him before. That evening, I sat in the living room with my notebook, adding Ethan's observations to my growing list of discrepancies. The evidence was mounting, pointing toward a conclusion so outlandish I could barely bring myself to write it down. There seemed to be two different Lauras. I nearly jumped out of my skin when Linda, my next-door neighbor of 15 years, knocked on my door. She'd brought back the casserole dish Laura had lent her last week. Your daughter-in-law is such a lovely girl, Margaret. Linda's voice lowered conspiratorially. But I noticed something odd. Yesterday she handed me this dish with her left hand, and I could have sworn you mentioned once she was right-handed. Or is she ambidextrous? I invited Linda in for tea, my mind racing. Even the neighbors were noticing these inconsistencies. I wasn't imagining things. Maybe she is, I replied noncommittally. People are full of surprises, aren't they? After Linda left, I added her observation to my notes. The evidence continued to accumulate like entries in a ledger that refused to balance. I found myself standing at the window watching Laura in the garden as she planted new marigolds, her movements graceful and assured, using her right hand. The woman I'd known for 7 years since Richard brought her home with stars in his eyes. The perfect daughter-in-law who'd slipped seamlessly into our family. Or had she? I remembered how Laura had entered my home with a confident smile and bright gaze, as if born to be a wonderful wife and mother. How lucky I'd felt to have a daughter-in-law like her. Beautiful, hard-working, always impeccable from her clothes to how she cared for Ethan. I recalled their wedding day in the backyard of her parents' modest house. How radiant she'd looked in her simple white dress, how Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. Now, watching her through the window, I wondered if I'd ever truly known her at all. The next morning, I decided to take more direct action. When Laura mentioned going to the market, I waited 5 minutes after she left, then followed her at a discreet distance. She walked her usual route toward Miller's grocery, but at the intersection where she should have turned right, she unexpectedly veered left down an alley behind the industrial district. My heart pounded as I followed, careful to stay hidden behind parked cars and dumpsters. This area was unfamiliar to me. Rows of dilapidated houses with peeling paint and rusted tin roofs, a far cry from our middle-class neighborhood. Laura moved purposefully, clearly familiar with these surroundings. She turned down an even narrower alley where sunlight barely penetrated between the crowded buildings. I hung back, concealing myself behind an auto repair shop where a man was focused on tightening nuts on an ancient car. From my vantage point, I watched as Laura approached a weathered wooden door, knocked softly, and disappeared inside. I stood frozen, uncertain what to do next. I could knock on that door myself, demand answers. But what if I was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation for all of this? I reluctantly turned back, my mind churning with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. When I arrived home, I froze in the doorway. Laura was standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, wearing a white blouse instead of the yellow floral dress she'd left in just 30 minutes ago. Her expression was cold, her movements sharp and efficient. Where did you go, Mom? Her voice held an edge I rarely heard. You're just getting back? I felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to process how she could have returned before me when I'd just seen her enter that mysterious house. I stammered out an excuse about taking a walk, then retreated to my room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely write in my notebook. Later that evening, Ethan came running to my room, his cheeks flushed from playing in the yard. He threw himself against my legs, sobbing. Grandma Mom yelled at me today just because I dropped a pencil. Not like yesterday. Yesterday she was really nice and helped me with my homework. She even hugged me. I gathered him in my arms, stroking his head while trying to keep my voice steady. Your mom was probably tired, sweetheart. We all have bad days sometimes. Ethan buried his face in my shoulder and whispered, "I want yesterday's mom back." His innocent words cut through me like a knife, carving the suspicions I'd been harboring even deeper into certainty. Something was terribly wrong in our home, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night I lay awake until the small hours, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight cast long shadows across my bedroom, fragments of a puzzle I couldn't solve. Joseph's voice echoed in my head. "She's on my flight. I'm looking right at her." Alongside it played Laura's voice from downstairs this afternoon. "Where did you go, Mom?" The two realities couldn't coexist yet. Somehow they did, intersecting in my home, my family. I reached for my notebook in the darkness and wrote by the light of my phone, "Maybe they are not the same person." The sentence stared back at me, impossible, yet increasingly plausible. If Laura had a twin or a doppelganger, it would explain the physical similarities and the behavioral discrepancies. It would explain how she could be in two places at once. But it opened up a host of new questions. Why the deception? Who was the real Laura? And what did it mean for Richard, for Ethan, for our family? The next morning, steeled with determination, I returned to that rundown neighborhood. I brought along the family photo from our living room, the one where Laura smiled radiantly beside Richard and Ethan at last year's Christmas. I approached a woman selling corn on the cob from a small cart, the smoke from her grill creating a fragrant haze. "Excuse me," I showed her the photo, my finger pointing to Laura's face. "Have you seen this young woman around here?" The vendor squinted at the image, then nodded without hesitation. "Oh yes, of course. She goes in and out of house number 14 over there all the time. That one with the stained walls." I thanked her, my heart pounding in my throat, and walked directly to the house she'd indicated. Number 14 loomed before me, its walls weather-beaten, the wooden door peeling a pot with a withered daisy on the windowsill. I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage, feeling as though the whole world was holding its breath with me. My knock echoed like a gunshot in the quiet alley. Each rap felt like a hammer blow to my chest, forcing my suspicions into the open, where they could no longer be denied or explained away. The door creaked open, and I found myself face to face with a woman identical to Laura. The same delicate features, the same long dark hair, the same slender build. But her eyes were different, frightened, uncertain, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish rag. "Laura," I whispered, though I already knew this wasn't my daughter-in-law. Not quite. The young woman started clutching the rag tighter and tried to slam the door shut. But a voice called from inside the small house, "Sophie, don't hide anymore. You also know this is wrong." I looked up to see another woman emerge from the shadows of the cramped room. She was thin, with her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Lucy Valera, Sophie's roommate. Mrs. Thompson, please come in. It's time you knew the truth." I stepped across the threshold, feeling as though I was crossing more than just a physical boundary. I was stepping from one reality into another, leaving behind the comforting illusions I'd lived with, and entering a world where my family's happiness was built on quicksand. The interior was even more depressing than the exterior suggested. Stained walls, cracked concrete floors, the faint smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. In one corner, an elderly man lay coughing weakly on a metal cot covered with a threadbare blanket. In another, a frail woman with completely white hair stared vacantly at the ceiling, her thin hands folded across her chest. The space felt suffocating, but I made myself walk forward and sit in the wooden chair Lucy indicated. The Laura lookalike lowered her face, her voice barely audible. "Forgive me. I'm not Laura. My name is Sophie." I stared at her, my mind whirling, unable to form words. The face was so familiar, yet now I could see subtle differences. A slightly more pronounced chin eyes, set a fraction wider apart, a small scar near her right eyebrow that Laura didn't have. "Why do you look so much like my daughter-in-law?" I finally managed my voice steadier than I expected. "And why do you show up at my house pretending to be her?" Sophie didn't answer immediately, her eyes filling with tears. Lucy sat beside her, poured a glass of water from a plastic pitcher, and began to speak in a calm, clear voice that belied the chaotic revelations she was about to deliver. "Sophie is very poor, Mrs. Thompson. Her adoptive parents are very ill, especially the man lying over there. A few years ago, Sophie met Laura by chance at a market. They looked like two peas in a pod, and Laura took advantage of that." I listened, my heart sinking with each word, as Lucy explained how Laura had proposed that Sophie pretend to be her, replacing her for a few hours whenever needed. Sophie had initially refused, but Laura paid well, enough for the medicine that kept Sophie's adoptive parents alive. The arrangement had started occasionally, but increased in frequency over the past year. Replace her for what I pressed my voice full of disbelief. Why would Laura need someone to impersonate her? Sophie looked up, her voice trembling. I don't know everything, ma'am. She just told me, stay in the house for a few hours, do some things like go to the market, take care of the boy, and that's it. She gave me money, a lot of money, enough for my parents' medicine. I didn't dare to ask for more. She lowered her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. I stared at her, feeling my chest tighten. Every strange detail of the past months suddenly made sense. The switching hands for writing the sometimes sweet and sometimes sour character, the honeyed voice that could turn cold in an instant. It all fit now like the last pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see. Lucy continued her gaze sharper. I don't know if this helps, but once I saw Laura with a very elegant man. His name is Victor Collins. I heard them calling each other my love in a coffee shop. Very affectionate. Sophie was waiting outside in the car, not understanding anything. The name Victor Collins struck me like a physical blow. I remembered Joseph's words. She's sitting in first class next to a rich man. The small room seemed to spin around me. I knocked over the glass of water but barely noticed as Lucy hurried to clean it up. Laura is cheating on my family. My voice choked on the words. Sophie broke down crying, her shoulders shaking. Forgive me, ma'am. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to save my parents. I looked at this young woman with Laura's face, but with eyes full of pain and regret. I wanted to be angry, to scream, to blame someone for the betrayal that was tearing through my family like wildfire. But looking at Sophie, I felt only pity. She wasn't the mastermind. She was just another piece in Laura's elaborate game. I stood up, trying to steady myself to make my voice firm through the storm of emotions. Sophie, do you know where Laura is? Do you know what she does when she asks you to impersonate her? Sophie shook her head, still crying. I don't know, ma'am. She just told me to do what she asked and that she would pay me. I didn't dare ask more. Lucy put a comforting hand on her shoulder, then turned to me. Mrs. Thompson, I know this is painful for you, but Sophie is also a victim. She had no other choice. I looked around the humble house, listening to the weak cough of the man on the cot. I understood Sophie's desperation, but it didn't erase the feeling of betrayal that burned within me. I clenched my fists, holding back tears. I don't blame you, Sophie, but I need to know the truth. I need to protect my son and my grandson. I stood to leave, feeling like the world was crashing down around me. Thank you, Lucy, for telling me the truth. I'll be back. I need to think. As I stepped back into the harsh sunlight, I felt as though I'd aged 10 years in that small, cramped room. The truth was like an icy wind, painful but clarifying. It swept away the comfortable illusions I'd lived with, leaving me exposed but clear-eyed. I needed to know more. I needed proof that would stand up to questioning, to disbelief. I needed to protect my family from the lies that had infiltrated our home like poison. The next morning, I returned to Sophie's house, clutching the family photo like a talisman. The sun beat down relentlessly, but I felt cold inside, as if I were carrying winter within me. I knocked on the peeling door of number 14, steeling myself for what might come next. This time, Sophie seemed less frightened. She opened the door with a shy but calmer look and invited me in. Mrs. Thompson, I was expecting you. Please come in. The house was unchanged. Still small, still smelling of disinfectant, still echoing with the weak cough from the cot in the corner. I sat in the wooden chair, the same one as yesterday, and looked directly at Sophie. Sophie, I want to meet your adoptive mother. I need to understand all of this better. Sophie nodded and led me to the corner where the thin woman with white hair lay in bed, her cloudy eyes staring at the ceiling. This is Mrs. Felicity Morris, my adoptive mother. I took the woman's fragile hand and introduced myself. I'm Margaret Thompson Richards' mother, Laura's mother-in-law. Mrs. Felicity looked at me, breathing with difficulty, and spoke in a voice as delicate as dried leaves. Sophie is not my biological daughter. She's a child I adopted when she was newborn. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. I stood frozen, my heart racing, but I managed to keep my voice level. Tell me, please, how did it happen? The elderly woman coughed, then slowly began to tell a story that unraveled everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law. Many years ago, I was a nurse in a small hospital in a rural town. A very poor family had twin girls. They were so destitute they couldn't keep both. The mother was crying, saying she could only keep one. The other they were going to abandon. Mrs. Felicity paused, overcome by a coughing fit, then continued, her voice growing weaker. My heart broke. I couldn't let them abandon that precious child. So I adopted her. That's Sophie. I raised her as my own, but I know she has always wanted to find her real parents. I sat gripping the edge of the chair, my head spinning. Do you know who Sophie's biological parents are? Mrs. Felicity shook her head. I only know they were a poor family from a nearby village. I didn't ask much. I just wanted to save the child. I turned to Sophie, who stood with her head bowed, tears streaming silently down her face. Mrs. Thompson, I don't know anything about my biological parents. But when I met Laura, I thought maybe she knew something. She looked so much like me, but she never told me anything about that. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I asked Mrs. Felicity to show me her old papers, hoping to find some clue. She pointed to a wooden wardrobe in the corner. Sophie retrieved a yellowed envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a copy of hospital records with Sophie's birth date. I scanned them quickly and felt my heart stop. The date matched exactly with Laura's birth date, the one I'd seen on her marriage certificate when she wed Richard. I gripped the documents with trembling hands and looked up at Sophie. You and Laura could be twin sisters. Sophie burst into tears, covering her face. So Laura is my sister. Why didn't she tell me anything? Why did she make me do all that? I stared at her, my heart breaking. I remembered the day Laura first came to our home, radiant and confident, as if she were born to be the perfect wife and mother. I had loved her, believed she would bring happiness to Richard. But now I knew that not only had she deceived my family, but she had also taken advantage of her own sister, using her as a double to hide secrets I hadn't even fully uncovered. I stood up, placed my hand on Sophie's shoulder, and spoke with a firmness that surprised even me. Sophie, from today on, I won't let anyone else take advantage of you. I'll help your parents with their illness, but in return, you have to cooperate with me. I need to bring this truth to light, for Richard, for Ethan. Sophie nodded, still crying. I'll help you. I don't want to live this lie anymore. I looked into her eyes and saw sincerity there, and for the first time since Joseph's phone call upended my world, I felt a small ray of hope amid the storm. As I left Sophie's house and walked back through the alley, my soul was in turmoil. I passed the bustling market where people were buying and laughing, oblivious to how my world had just shattered. Mrs. Felicity's words echoed in my mind like funeral bells. 2 twins, one abandoned, one raised, and now their fates had crossed in my own family, creating a web of deception that threatened everything I loved. I returned home with my heart as heavy as stone. The truth about Laura and Sophie, the secret of the twins, was crushing my chest. I stood at a crossroads I'd never anticipated whether to confront my daughter-in-law, the woman who had deceived us all, or to shield Richard and Ethan from a truth that would devastate them. That night I called Joseph, my voice firm despite my inner turmoil. Joseph, tomorrow night you need to come to the house. There are things I need you to clarify. Joseph sounded surprised concern evident in his voice. Mom, has something serious happened? Just come, son. I need you. And if you can bring Laura's electronic passport. He didn't ask further questions, just said, yes, Mom. I'll be there. I hung up and sat down, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I knew that tomorrow night would be one that no one in this family would ever forget. The night when the careful facade that Laura had constructed would finally come crashing down. The next day I rose early and prepared for what would be the most difficult family dinner of my life. I covered the dining table with a crisp white tablecloth, lit candles, and cooked Richard's favorite pot roast and Ethan's preferred grilled fish. I wanted this dinner to be special, not to celebrate, but to mark a before and after in our family's story. As I chopped vegetables in the kitchen, my mind wandered between Sophie's dingy alley and her tearful confession. I told myself I needed to be strong for Richard, for Ethan, but each cut of the knife felt like a cut to my own heart. When Richard came home as dusk fell tired from work, he was surprised by the elaborate table setting. What are we celebrating that you've made so much food, Mom? I smiled, trying to appear calm. I just wanted us all to have a nice dinner. Sit down, son. Laura entered wearing a light blue dress, her smile soft, but with a hint of nervousness in her eyes that I'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. Ethan ran to hug my legs. Grandma, the fish smells so good. I stroked his head, a lump forming in my throat. I knew that after tonight, Ethan's innocent smile might never be so carefree again. We sat down to dinner, and at first the atmosphere was lively. Richard talked about a new project at work. Ethan spoke excitedly about the drawing he'd made at school. Laura nodded, commenting occasionally, but I noticed her hand trembled slightly as she held her fork. She'd been playing this role for so long. How had I not seen through it before I took a deep breath and signaled to Joseph, who was waiting outside as planned? He entered, and right behind him came Sophie, wearing a simple dress, her face identical to Laura's, but wearing an expression full of anguish. Everyone at the table fell silent. Matthew looked from Laura to Sophie in confusion and asked with childlike innocence, "Why are there two mommies?" Richard turned pale and dropped his spoon with a clatter. Laura jumped up her chair, scraping against the floor as she shouted, "What is all this about Mom?" I stood up, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. My voice came out slow but firm. "Sit down, Laura. I need us to clear everything up." In the tense silence that followed, I began to unravel the tapestry of lies. Joseph's call from the airport when he saw Laura on a flight to Paris while she was supposedly at home, the inconsistencies in handwriting and behavior, and finally my visit to the alley where I discovered Sophie and the truth about the twins. "You and Sophie are twin sisters," I said, looking directly into Laura's eyes, which had gone cold and hard. "You took advantage of your sister to hide your double life. Tell us the truth." Laura trembled, her face white as paper. She screamed, trying to defend herself. "You're making everything up to humiliate me. How dare you?" But Joseph stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the table. "This is a copy of the electronic passport with the entry and exit stamp from France. You can't be at home and fly to France at the same time." Laura stared at the papers, her lips pressed into a thin line, unable to respond. Ethan, sitting beside her, suddenly spoke up in a small, pained voice. "It's true, Grandma. Some days my mommy is an angel, and other days she's very mean. I don't like the mean mommy." My grandson's words pierced my heart like a knife, and I had to fight back tears. The air in the room felt suffocating, charged with the electricity of unspoken truths finally coming to light. I nodded to Lucy, who had slipped in through the back door. She stood with her sharp gaze fixed on Laura and told everyone what she'd witnessed. I saw Laura with Victor Collins. They were calling each other my love, and she was the one who hired Sophie to impersonate her and deceive this family. Richard turned to his wife, his voice breaking. "Is it true, Laura? Tell me, is it true?" Laura sat in stubborn silence for a long moment. Then, as if a dam had broken, she suddenly screamed, her voice full of venom. "Yes, it's true I have a lover. I'm sick of this poor life, sick of being the daughter-in-law in this house. Victor gives me a life 100 times better. And you, Richard, you're useless." Her cruel words exploded in the room like a bomb. Richard stood frozen, clenching his fists so tightly they turned white. Ethan burst into tears and ran to me, his voice trembling. "Grandma, what did Mommy say?" I held him close, my own tears finally spilling over. I looked at Laura and saw a stranger, standing there with a cold expression without a hint of remorse for the pain she'd caused. The woman I'd welcomed into our family, whom I'd loved like a daughter, had been an illusion all along. Richard stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Laura, do you really mean that?" She turned away without answering, her silence more damning than any words could have been. Sophie, who had been quiet at the edge of the room, suddenly spoke, her voice low but clear. "Sister, you didn't have to hurt them like this. I just wanted to help you, but I didn't know you would go this far." Laura glared at her with contempt but said nothing. She simply turned and walked out. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving us in a painful silence filled with the pieces of our shattered family. In that moment, standing in my dining room with my devastated son, my confused grandson, and the identical twin who had unwittingly been part of Laura's deception, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The truth had come at a terrible cost, but as Robert used to say, "The truth will set you free, Margaret." I just hadn't anticipated how painful that freedom would be. After Laura stormed out, the dining room fell into a suffocating silence. The candles I'd lit earlier flickered in the sudden draft from the slammed door, casting elongated shadows across our faces. Richard remained standing, his expression frozen, somewhere between shock and devastation. Ethan clung to my legs, his small body trembling with sobs. Sophie stood awkwardly by the doorway, her presence both essential to the truth and a painful reminder of the deception that had shattered our family. Women aren't easily fooled, and I'd followed my instincts despite doubting myself at every turn. Now, facing the wreckage, I wondered if the truth had been worth the cost. Lucy was the first to break the silence, her practical nature cutting through the emotional haze. "The truth hurts, but living a lie hurts more in the long run. Better to face it now than 10 years from now. I guided everyone back to the table, serving fresh cups of tea with trembling hands. Richard finally sank into his chair, rubbing his face as if trying to physically wipe away what he'd just witnessed. "When did you first suspect something wasn't right?" His voice emerged hollow, stripped of its usual confidence. I explained about Joseph's call, the inconsistencies I'd noticed in my investigation. As I spoke, Richard's expression shifted from disbelief to recognition, as if puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place in his mind as well. She was different sometimes. I thought maybe she was just stressed about something. I should have paid more attention. Joseph placed his hand on his brother's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. None of us saw it clearly. Laura was careful. Sophie remained quiet, her gaze fixed on her folded hands until Richard finally acknowledged her presence. His eyes, red-rimmed but clear, studied her face so identical to his wife's, yet somehow different in ways that now seemed obvious. "She never told you we were married, never mentioned Ethan?" Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She told me she needed someone to cover for her occasionally at family events when she had business trips. I had no idea she was seeing someone else. When I saw photos in your house, she said they were cousins she was close with. I believed her, she paid well, and my parents needed the medicine." Richard's expression hardened at the mention of money. "How much did she pay you $2,500 each time?" Sophie whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "Sometimes I'd stay a few hours, sometimes a full day." The amount hung in the air like smoke. For our middle-class family, $2,500 was significant, far more than Laura should have had access to from her part-time work at the boutique and Richard's architect salary. Where did she get that kind of money? Richard's voice cracked on the final word. I cleared my throat, deciding it was time to share what else I'd discovered. I checked her bank statements. There have been regular deposits of $8,000 a month for the past year, from an account under the name VQC Holdings. Victor Quinn Collins. Lucy's voice sliced through the room with surgical precision. He owns that hotel chain with properties all over Skyview luxury suites. His net worth is about $80 million, mostly in real estate. Richard's face drained of all remaining color as the scope of Laura's betrayal expanded beyond the personal into the financial. Ethan, who had been quietly sniffling beside me, suddenly looked up with a child's innocent wisdom. "Is that why Mom has two different purses? The black one has lots of money in it. I saw it once when she thought I was sleeping." Out of the mouths of babes comes truth that adults overlook. I'd been so focused on the physical and behavioral differences between Laura and Sophie that I'd missed the material evidence hiding in plain sight. The designer clothes that appeared in Laura's closet, despite our modest income, the new jewelry she claimed were good replicas, the weekend girls' trips that had become more frequent over the past year. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I think I should go. This is a family matter, and I've caused enough no." Richard's voice was unexpectedly firm. "You're as much a victim in this as we are. Maybe more." I studied my son with newfound admiration. Despite his world crumbling around him, he retained the compassion that had always been his defining quality. In that moment, watching him straighten his shoulders against the weight of betrayal, I saw Robert's strength in him. Sophie, hesitant but clearly relieved, settled back into her chair. I never meant to become part of a deception. When I first met Laura at the farmer's market 3 years ago, it was like looking in a mirror. We were both so shocked. She approached me, not the other way around. The timeline sent another jolt through me. 3 years ago, a full year before Laura and Richard had even met. This hadn't been an affair that developed after marriage. It had been a calculated plan from the beginning. My stomach churned at the implications. Lucy, who had been watching the exchange silently, suddenly spoke up. "There's something else you should know. Laura has been making inquiries about selling property recently. I overheard her and Victor discussing it at the cafe, something about liquidating assets in preparation for a move." Richard's head snapped up. "What property? We only own this house, and it's in both our names. She can't sell it without my signature." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's not about this house, Richard. I think she was planning to leave soon with whatever money she could take." The realization that Laura had been planning her exit strategy settled over the room like a shroud. We'd been living with a ticking time bomb in our midst, blissfully unaware as she prepared to detonate our family. Joseph, who had remained stoically supportive throughout, finally spoke. "Mom, I need to get back to the airport soon. My flight leaves in 3 hours. What's the plan now?" His practical question brought me back to myself. We'd exposed the truth, but what came next? How does a family rebuild from such a foundation-shaking betrayal? Sophie, I began my mind formulating a plan as I spoke. You said your parents need medical care. How much would it cost to get them proper treatment at a good facility? She looked startled by the change in subject. About $4,000 a month for both. Their conditions are chronic, not terminal, but the medications and home nursing visits add up. I nodded, a decision crystallizing in my mind. After Robert died, I'd done more than just grieve. I'd planned. The life insurance payout of $250,000 had seemed enormous at the time, but rather than spending it, I'd studied investment strategies and built a portfolio that had quietly grown to over $1.8 million. No one in the family knew about this nest egg. I'd kept it separate, wanting my sons to build their own security rather than relying on an inheritance. Now that prudence would pay off in unexpected ways. I'll cover your parents' medical expenses, $3,000 monthly transferred directly to their care providers. In exchange, I need your complete cooperation in untangling this mess Laura has created. Sophie's eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock. Mrs. Thompson, that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept. A woman must know her worth, and I won't allow anyone else to take advantage of my family or you. Sophie, from today forward, you're not a pawn in Laura's game anymore. Lucy smiled approvingly, and even Richard looked at me with new appreciation, as if seeing beyond Mom to the capable woman I'd always been. In that moment, I felt a strength I hadn't accessed in years, the same determination that had gotten me through Robert's death, through raising 2 boys alone, through rebuilding a life when half of mine had been ripped away. The next morning brought gray skies and a steady drizzle that matched our collective mood. Richard had called in sick to work, spending most of the night staring at old photographs with reddened eyes. Ethan, picking up on the household's tension despite our efforts to shield him, had crawled into my bed around midnight, seeking the stability only a grandmother could provide when his world was in flux. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard an unfamiliar sound from upstairs, like furniture being moved. Setting down the whisk, I climbed the stairs to find Laura in our bedroom, rummaging through my antique secretary desk where I kept important papers. The sight of her, this woman I'd trusted, this stranger in my home, pawing through my personal belongings, ignited something cold and fierce within me. I stood in the doorway watching as she pried at the locked bottom drawer, unaware of my presence. Finding something interesting, Laura. My voice cut through the room. She startled violently, dropping the letter opener she'd been using as a makeshift pry bar. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp as an accusation. Laura straightened, a practiced smile sliding onto her face like a mask. Mom, I was just looking for the insurance information. Ethan's school needs an updated copy. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a second I almost doubted myself again. Almost. But the drawer she'd been attempting to force contained nothing related to Ethan's school, only my financial documents, property deeds, and the folder with my investment portfolio information. I maintained eye contact as I crossed the room, retrieving the letter opener from the floor. The antique silver felt cool against my palm, a family heirloom from Robert's mother that Laura had clearly recognized as valuable. Silence is not absence. Silence is choice. Silence is strength dressed in satin. I placed the opener back on the desk, my movements deliberate and unhurried. Laura's smile faltered at the edges, uncertainty creeping into her expression as I failed to respond to her explanation. A flash of something frustration-fear crossed her features before she regained control. You don't believe me. After everything I've done for this family, you'd take the word of some lookalike over mine. Laura's voice hitched with practiced emotion, tears gathering in her eyes on cue. I studied her performance with newfound clarity. How many times had I seen this exact display of wounded innocence? How often had I comforted her, reassured her, defended her, only to be manipulated yet again? The passport stamps don't lie, Laura. Neither does the money trail, or Sophie's existence, or Victor Collins. She flinched at the name, her mask slipping momentarily before she recovered. Victor is a business associate. I've been developing a side career in interior design. He's been mentoring me. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her continued deception. Even now, caught red-handed, she couldn't bring herself to admit the truth. It spoke to a pathology deeper than I'd imagined, a commitment to falsehood that had become her baseline reality. Pack whatever belongs solely to you. Leave anything purchased with family money. You have until noon. Laura's facade crumbled completely, her expression morphing from fake hurt to genuine rage. You can't throw me out. This is my house, too. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. We both know what you were planning. Liquidating assets prepared to abandon Richard and Ethan once you'd extracted what you wanted. I'm just accelerating your timeline. For a moment, I glimpsed the real Laura beneath the polished exterior, calculating cold, furious at being outmaneuvered by a woman she'd dismissed as an irrelevant old lady. The transformation was chilling. You have no idea what I'm capable of, she hissed, dropping all pretense of the loving daughter-in-law. I held her gaze unflinching. Neither did you. After Laura stormed out, I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling with delayed reaction. I'd spent years believing I knew this woman, welcoming her into our most intimate family moments. The depth of the deception made me question my own judgment, my own perceptions of reality. The sound of Ethan's laughter drifted up from downstairs, followed by Richard's deeper voice. The noise jolted me back to the present, to what mattered. Laura had betrayed us all, but the family that remained was worth fighting for. I made my way downstairs to find Richard and Ethan at the kitchen table, a half-assembled model airplane between them. The scene was so normal, so achingly domestic, that my throat tightened with emotion. They looked up as I entered, twin expressions of cautious hope on their faces. Mom, I think we're going to be okay. Richard's voice was stronger than it had been since the revelation, his eyes clearer. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of my son beneath my palm. We will be. It will take time, but we're Thompsons. We don't break easily. Later that afternoon, as Richard took Ethan to soccer practice, an attempt at maintaining normalcy, I met with Sophie and Lucy at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. The location felt symbolic, a neutral ground where we could begin building bridges between our separate worlds. Sophie arrived first, dressed simply in jeans and a faded blue sweater that emphasized how different her style was from Laura's carefully curated wardrobe. She twisted her hands nervously, a mannerism I'd never observed in my daughter-in-law. Mrs. Thompson, I've been thinking about your offer. It's incredibly generous, but I need to ask, why would you help me after what happened? The question was direct, honest, in a way Laura never was. I stirred my coffee, considering my response carefully. When I was 30, I made a mistake similar to what you've been doing. I knew my sister's husband was cheating, but said nothing, thinking I was protecting her. It was my greatest regret. She lived 15 more years in a lie before discovering the truth, and never forgave me for not telling her sooner. I sipped my coffee, the memory still bitter after all these decades. Sometimes we make choices we think are right at the time, usually out of fear or necessity. The real test is what we do once we know better. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but these weren't the practiced manipulative tears Laura had perfected. They were genuine, spilling over without performance or calculation. Lucy arrived moments later, sliding into the booth with her usual directness. I've been doing more digging on Victor Collins. He's not just wealthy, he's connected. His development company has projects in 6 countries, and he sits on the boards of 2 major banks. If Laura is involved with him financially, it could get complicated. I absorbed this information mentally, adding it to the growing dossier of concerns. We needed to move carefully, protecting Richard and Ethan while untangling the web Laura had woven around our family. But first, we needed to understand the full scope of the deception. Sophie, I need you to tell me everything about how this arrangement started. Leave nothing out, no matter how insignificant it might seem. For the next hour, Sophie shared details that filled crucial gaps in my understanding. She and Laura had first met at the West Side Farmers Market 3 years ago. Laura had approached her, not the other way around. After the initial shock of their uncanny resemblance, Laura had maintained contact, occasionally meeting for coffee, asking questions about Sophie's background and family. 6 months before meeting Richard, Laura had proposed the arrangement Sophie would occasionally pretend to be her, allowing Laura freedom to pursue career opportunities. The deception began small, covering for Laura during a family dinner here, a weekend obligation there. After the marriage, the impersonations increased, especially after Ethan's birth. I never thought it would become so frequent. Sophie confessed, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the tabletop. At first, it was maybe once a month. This past year, it's been 2 or 3 times a week. I started to feel wrong about it, especially with Ethan. He'd get so confused when I didn't know things Mommy should know. What about Laura's background? I pressed. Did she ever mention her parents, her childhood? Sophie shook her head. She always deflected personal questions, said she was from upstate New York, raised by a single mother who died when she was in college. No siblings, No extended family. Whenever I asked about her past, she'd change the subject. Lucy, who had been taking notes on her phone, looked up with a frown. That contradicts what she told Richard about growing up in Connecticut with both parents until they divorced when she was 16. And I distinctly remember her mentioning a brother in Seattle at your Christmas party last year. The contradictions didn't surprise me anymore. Laura had created multiple versions of herself tailored to different audiences. The woman Richard had married was largely fictional, a character crafted to appeal to his specific desires and needs. There's one more thing, Sophie said hesitantly. About a month ago, Laura asked me to sign some papers, said they were consent forms for using my likeness in some promotional materials for her design business. I was rushing to get to my second job, so I signed without reading carefully. My blood ran cold. What kind of papers? Do you have copies? Sophie shook her head. Regret etched across her features. She never gave me copies. I asked later and she said they were filed with the company. Lucy's expression turned grim. Could be anything. Power of attorney property transfers, loan applications. With identical signatures, she could have set up quite a scheme. The implications sent my mind racing. If Laura had been planning a major financial move using Sophie's identity, we needed to act quickly. The legal entanglements could become disastrous, especially with someone as powerful as Victor Collins potentially involved. We need a lawyer, I decided aloud, and we need to freeze any accounts connected to Richard immediately. Lucy nodded in agreement. I know someone, Patricia Winters, specializes in financial fraud and identity theft. Tough as nails, but compassionate with victims. As we prepared to leave, Sophie reached across the table and grasped my hand, a gesture so unexpected it momentarily startled me. Her fingers were work-roughened, unlike Laura's perpetually manicured hands. Thank you for not hating me. Most people would. I squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Hate requires energy. I'd rather spend rebuilding what's been broken. The following week passed in a blur of legal consultations, financial damage control, and emotional triage. Patricia Winters, Lucy's attorney contact, proved worth every penny of her considerable fee. Within days, she had secured temporary freezes on all joint accounts, filed identity theft reports on Sophie's behalf, and begun the process of documenting Laura's financial deceptions for the eventual divorce proceedings. Laura herself remained conspicuously absent, having cleared out her personal belongings, while Richard and Ethan were at soccer practice. Her departure might have seemed like abandonment to some, but to me it felt like the removal of a slow-acting poison from our household. Even in her absence, her impact lingered. Richard slept poorly. Ethan asked repeatedly for nice mommy versus mean mommy, still struggling to understand that they were different people. On Wednesday evening, I was reviewing financial documents at the kitchen table when Richard returned from work earlier than usual. His expression was thunderous, his movements jerky with suppressed emotion as he dropped his briefcase by the door. They knew, he announced without preamble. Jeff and Michael at the office. They've seen Laura with Collins multiple times at the Westview Hotel. They thought I had some kind of arrangement, that I was okay with it. The humiliation in his voice cut through me. It wasn't enough that Laura had betrayed him privately. She'd made him an object of pity and speculation among his colleagues. The public dimension of the betrayal added a new layer of injury. I set aside the papers and moved to the cabinet where we kept the good Scotch Robert's favorite, which I'd preserved for special occasions. Pouring 2 fingers into crystal tumblers, I handed one to Richard and took the other for myself. Your father always said that seeing someone's true colors isn't a loss. It's an expensive but valuable education. We clinked glasses, the crystal producing a clear, perfect tone that seemed to momentarily cut through the emotional static. Richard took a sip, the amber liquid momentarily softening the hard lines of anger around his mouth. He called me today, he continued after a moment. Collins said he wants to resolve things amicably. Offered a settlement if I'll agree to a quick, quiet divorce. My grip tightened on the glass. What did you tell him? Richard's laugh held no humor. I told him he could contact my lawyer, then I hung up. But Mom, he offered $500,000. Cash. The amount was staggering, far more than would be standard in a divorce settlement for a marriage of their duration. It suggested not just wealth, but urgency, a desire to make the problem disappear quickly and quietly. That's not a settlement offer. That's a bribe to prevent scrutiny. My instincts from years in accounting sharpened like a predator scenting blood. They're hiding something bigger than an affair. Richard nodded, his expression shifting from anger to a more focused determination that reminded me of Robert when he'd found his path forward through a problem. Let's find out what it is. The next day brought another revelation. Sophie arrived at our house mid-morning, her face pale and drawn. She'd received a text message from Laura, the first contact since the confrontation. She wants to meet. Just me at the Lakeside Park gazebo. Says she has something important to tell me about our birth parents. I frowned, immediately suspicious of Laura's timing and motivations. The sudden interest in reconnecting Sophie with their biological origins seemed calculated rather than genuine, especially given that Laura had kept the twin relationship secret for 3 years. It's a manipulation tactic, I warned. She knows your desire to find your birth family is a vulnerability she can exploit. Sophie twisted her hands in her lap, conflict evident in her expression. I know it's probably a trick, but what if it's not? What if she actually has information? I've wondered my whole life. The longing in her voice was palpable, the deep human desire to understand one's origins, to know where and who you came from. Laura was dangling the one thing guaranteed to override Sophie's caution. Lucy, who had become a regular presence in our strategy sessions, suggested a compromise. We'll go with you. Stay at a distance, but close enough to intervene if needed. The Lakeside Park gazebo had been a favorite spot for our family outings when the boys were young. Its white-painted lattice and curved benches overlooked the shimmering waters of Lake Michigan, the Chicago skyline visible in the distance on clear days. As Sophie waited nervously on a bench, Lucy and I positioned ourselves at a hot dog vendor's cart about 50 yards away, close enough to observe while remaining inconspicuous. Laura arrived precisely on time, her appearance flawless as always. Designer sunglasses perched on her nose, a cream-colored trench coat belted at her waist, high-heeled boots that clicked purposefully on the concrete path. Even from a distance, I could see how she carried herself differently than Sophie, shoulders back, chin lifted every movement, deliberate and controlled. The twins' conversation lasted approximately 15 minutes. From our vantage point, we could see Laura doing most of the talking, leaning in with the persuasive body language I'd seen her use countless times when convincing Richard of something. Sophie remained largely still, her posture becoming increasingly rigid as the conversation progressed. When Laura finally departed, Sophie remained seated for several long minutes before walking slowly toward our position. Her expression was shuttered, her earlier hopeful anticipation replaced by a cool detachment that seemed borrowed from her twin. "What happened?" Lucy asked as Sophie reached us. Sophie's laugh held a bitter edge I'd never heard from her before. She didn't have any information about our birth parents. That was just bait to get me here. Her real purpose was to offer me $200,000 to disappear, go back to my pathetic life, and never contact Richard or Ethan again. The callousness of the approach, using Sophie's deepest longing as leverage for a crude bribe, revealed yet another layer of Laura's ruthlessness. It confirmed my growing suspicion that there was more at stake than a simple infidelity. Laura and Collins were willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money to sever all connections cleanly. Did she mention Collins? I asked, my mind cataloging potential motivations. Sophie nodded, her expression grim. She said he has resources and connections that could make life very difficult for me if I don't cooperate. When I refused her offer, she said I'd regret choosing the losing side. As we drove home, I mentally reviewed what we knew. Collins was wealthy, connected, and apparently concerned enough about the situation to authorize significant payoffs. Laura had been systematically creating a dual identity, possibly preparing for a major financial move. And now they were actively threatening anyone who might interfere with their plans. The pattern suggested something beyond a typical affair, something that might involve financial impropriety on a scale that warranted further investigation. Back at home, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of our response. For years, I'd maintained a friendship with Eleanor Jenkins, a former colleague from my accounting days who had gone on to work for the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. We'd kept in touch through holiday cards and occasional lunches, but I hadn't reached out to her professionally until now. Eleanor met me at a small diner far from both our homes, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in the same no-nonsense bun she'd worn 20 years earlier. She listened without interruption as I outlined the situation, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Margaret, based on what you've described, this has red flags for several potential federal crimes: identity theft, wire fraud, possibly money laundering if Collins' businesses are involved. The international properties add another dimension that could trigger additional jurisdictions." I pushed the folder containing copies of our documentation across the table. It's all circumstantial at this point. We don't have smoking gun proof of anything beyond the identity deception. Eleanor flipped through the pages, her trained eye catching details I might have missed. This pattern of transfers between accounts shifting money just below reporting thresholds is classic structuring. And these property listings in Sophie's name. She looked up, her expression grave. Did your daughter-in-law ever mention real estate investments to your son? Never. Their finances were supposedly transparent to each other. These properties must have been titled using Sophie's identity without her knowledge. Eleanor closed the folder with a decisive snap. I'll need to take this up the chain, but unofficially, tell your family to be careful. If Collins is involved in what this suggests, he has resources beyond money people who solve problems permanently. Her warning sent a chill through me, transforming our understanding of the situation from a painful family drama into something potentially dangerous. As I drove home, my hands tight on the steering wheel, I realized that uncovering the truth might have placed all of us, Richard, Ethan, Sophie, even myself, into a vulnerability we hadn't anticipated. That night I gathered Richard, Sophie, and Lucy in our living room, the curtains drawn against the possibility of watching eyes. I relayed Eleanor's assessment and warning, watching their expressions shift from determination to sobered concern. So we're not just dealing with a cheating spouse, Richard concluded, his voice flat. We're potentially up against organized financial crime. Lucy nodded, her practical nature already moving toward solutions. We need to be strategic. Document everything, create backups, establish regular check-in protocols. As they discussed security measures, I watched Sophie, who had grown increasingly pale during the conversation. The reality of her unwitting role in Laura's schemes seemed to be fully hitting her for the first time. She used me like a blank check. Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. My face, my identity, my signature. All these years I thought I was just covering for her occasional absences, but she was building an entire alternate financial life in my name. The betrayal transcended the personal into something that could have lifelong repercussions for Sophie. If Laura had committed crimes using her twin's identity, disentangling the legal implications could take years. I moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her trembling hands in mine. We'll fix this. All of it. Whatever she's done in your name, we'll prove it wasn't you. Sophie looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, but also with a newfound resolve that resonated with my own determination. I trusted the wrong person because she looked like me. I won't make that mistake again. In that moment, I recognized something in Sophie that I'd seen in the mirror after Robert's death, the steely core of resilience that forms when everything you thought you could count on dissolves beneath your feet. It was the beginning of strength, dressed in vulnerability's clothing, and it would serve her well in the battles to come. As our impromptu war council continued mapping out next steps and contingencies, I found myself thinking of Robert, what he would say, how he would approach this threat to our family. His favorite saying during difficult times echoed in my mind, "The truth is never comfortable, but it's the only foundation worth building on." We were finally facing the full truth of Laura's deception, not just the personal betrayal, but the potentially criminal enterprise it had masked. The foundation had been revealed as rotten, but from here we could begin rebuilding on solid ground. And if Victor Collins or Laura thought they could intimidate us into silence or compliance, they were about to learn a painful lesson about underestimating the Thompson family, particularly its matriarch. A week after our confrontation with Laura at Lakeside Park, we received the news that would change everything. Eleanor's FBI connections had moved with surprising speed, likely due to Victor Collins already being on their radar. The headline splashed across the Chicago Tribune's front page, "Real estate mogul Victor Collins arrested on charges of fraud money laundering." A photo showed Collins being escorted into the federal building, his normally imperious expression replaced by shock and fury. Richard placed the newspaper on our breakfast table, his finger tapping the smaller headline below. Investigation uncovers elaborate identity theft scheme involving twin sisters. Though the article didn't name Laura or Sophie directly, the implications were clear to our family. They actually did it. They got him. Richard's voice contained equal parts vindication and disbelief. I sipped my coffee, maintaining a composed exterior, despite the rush of satisfaction. The FBI doesn't publicize cases unless they're confident in their evidence. Collins must have been under investigation for some time. The article detailed how authorities had uncovered a complex scheme involving luxury properties being purchased under false identities, then used as collateral for loans that were funneled through offshore accounts. The total fraud was estimated at over $30 million, spanning 5 years and 3 countries. What the article didn't mention, what only we knew, was Laura's pivotal role in the operation. She had provided the perfect cover, a respectable architect's wife with an identical twin whose identity could be exploited without raising suspicions. The complete picture was still emerging, but the scale suggested this had been Laura's primary motivation for marrying Richard all along, creating an airtight social alibi while she and Collins executed their scheme. "There's a prosecutor who wants to talk to Sophie," Richard added, scanning further down the page. "They're building a case against Laura, too." I nodded, unsurprised. Sophie's testimony would be crucial in establishing the identity theft component. Though victimized, she would face intense scrutiny and potentially hostile cross-examination if the case went to trial. The doorbell interrupted our discussion. Lucy stood on the porch, her typically composed demeanor fractured by evident agitation. She thrust her phone toward us the moment we opened the door. She's been calling Sophie nonstop since dawn, threatening her, then offering money, then threatening again. I recorded the last one. Lucy pressed play, and Laura's voice filled the entryway, familiar yet transformed by desperation into something harsh and unrecognizable. "You stupid, ungrateful bitch. I gave you more money than you'd ever see in your pathetic little life, and this is how you repay me. By running to the feds, they're going to throw away the key on Victor because of you, and I'm going down with him unless you fix this." The recording continued, detailing increasingly frantic offers, alternating with vicious threats. Laura promised $1 million for Sophie to take full responsibility, claiming she had been the mastermind all along. When that didn't work, she threatened to have people visit Sophie's parents in their care facility. Where's Sophie now? The protective instinct that had defined my motherhood surged anew, extending now to this young woman who had unwittingly become entangled in our family drama. "She's safe. I took her to my sister's place in Highland Park. No one knows about it. But she's terrified, Mrs. Thompson. These aren't empty threats. Collins has connections with dangerous people." Richard grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, his face set with determination. "Let's go. We need to talk to Sophie directly, figure out next steps together." The drive to Highland Park took 40 minutes each passing mile, increasing my sense of urgency. We found Sophie huddled on a floral-patterned couch in Lucy's sister's sunroom, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Dark circles underlined her eyes, testament to a sleepless night. She tried to force a smile as we entered, but it crumbled almost immediately. The calls started at 5 this morning, first from a blocked number, then from different phones. She knows where my parents are staying. She described the facility the color of my father's blanket. I sat beside her, taking her cold hands in mine. "We won't let anything happen to them. Or to you. The FBI has resources to protect witnesses, especially in high-profile cases like this one." Sophie shook her head, fresh tears spilling. "You don't understand. It's not just Laura. She said there are others involved, people who stand to lose everything if Collins talks. People who solve problems permanently." The phrase echoed Eleanor's warning, confirming our worst fears about the extent of Collins' connections. This was no longer merely about exposing Laura's betrayal or reclaiming Sophie's stolen identity. It had escalated into a situation where lives could be at risk. Richard paced the length of the sunroom, his architect's mind visibly mapping out contingencies and structural supports for our precarious situation. "We need to get ahead of this. Right now we're reacting to their moves instead of making our own." Lucy's sister brought a tray of tea, her curious gaze suggesting she knew we were embroiled in something serious, but had the discretion not to pry. After she withdrew, we formed a tight circle, speaking in lowered voices despite being alone in the house. For the next hour, we formulated a multi-layered response to the threats. Lucy would contact Eleanor directly, requesting federal protection for Sophie's parents, and arranging for Sophie to give her formal statement to prosecutors, immediately securing her status as a cooperating witness rather than a potential suspect. Richard would engage our lawyer to file for emergency protective orders against Laura and any known associates of Collins. And I would handle what might prove to be the most delicate aspect of all, reaching out to Gloria the twins' biological mother, whom we had recently located through Mrs. Felicity's old records. If Laura was threatening Sophie's adoptive parents, she might well target Gloria too, especially if she believed the older woman possessed information that could further incriminate her. Beyond that practical concern, I felt instinctively that Gloria might be key to understanding Laura's psychology, what had shaped her into someone capable of such calculated deception and cruelty. As we prepared to leave Highland Park, Sophie caught my arm, her fingers pressing urgently into my sleeve. "There's something else. Something Laura said that I didn't tell you before because it seemed impossible. She claimed our birth mother has money, a lot of money, real estate holdings worth millions that will transfer to her daughters upon her death. The revelation cast Laura's actions in yet another light. Perhaps the identity theft scheme with Collins hadn't been her only financial motivation. If Gloria was indeed wealthy, Laura might have been playing a much longer, more complex game than we'd realized, one that involved not just criminal enterprise, but inheritance manipulation as well. I squeezed Sophie's hand reassuringly. We'll figure this out. All of it. One step at a time. Driving back to Chicago, Richard was uncharacteristically silent, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Only as we neared our neighborhood did he finally speak, his voice rough with emotion. I keep thinking about Ethan. How am I supposed to explain to a 7-year-old that his mother was a criminal who never really loved us, that she married me as a cover story? The question hung in the car like a physical presence. There was no adequate answer, no parenting handbook for explaining such a profound betrayal to a child. Ethan had already been confused by the concept of his two mommies, the kind one and the mean one. How could he possibly process that neither version had been genuinely invested in him as a son? Children don't need perfect answers. They need honest ones delivered with love. I spoke from experience, remembering how I'd had to explain Robert's death to a teenage Richard and 11-year-old Joseph. Some truths can't be softened, only cushioned by the assurance that whatever happens, they are deeply loved by those who remain. The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Lucy arrived early with Sophie, both looking marginally better after a night at a hotel under assumed names, a precaution suggested by Eleanor. The protective orders had been granted overnight, thanks to our lawyer's connections with a sympathetic judge. Sophie's parents had been temporarily relocated to a secure medical facility with restricted visitor access. As we gathered in the living room to coordinate our next steps, Ethan wandered in still in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped short when he saw Sophie, his expression brightening. "Nice, Mommy, you're back." He launched himself into her arms with complete trust, burying his face against her shoulder. The room fell silent, the adults exchanging uncertain glances over Ethan's head. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she gently disentangled herself, kneeling to meet his gaze. "Ethan, sweetie, I need to tell you something important. I'm not your mommy. I'm your Auntie Sophie. I look like your mom because we're twins, like two copies of the same person. But we're different inside." Ethan's brow furrowed as he processed this information, his 7-year-old mind grappling with concepts that even adults found disorienting. After a long moment, he spoke with surprising clarity. "So you're the nice one who reads me stories and cuts the crusts off my sandwich. And the other one is the mean one who yells and doesn't know the sunshine song. But neither one is really my mommy." The innocent precision of his assessment left us momentarily speechless. Richard knelt beside his son, placing a gentle hand on his small shoulder. "Your birth mom, Laura, she had to go away. She did some bad things and made bad choices. But that's not because of you. You didn't do anything wrong." Ethan considered this, his expression serious beyond his years. "Can Auntie Sophie stay with us? She does mommy things better anyway." The simplicity of his solution, unencumbered by adult complications, broke the tension in the room. Even Richard managed a small smile as he ruffled his son's hair. "That's something grown-ups need to figure out, buddy. But Sophie will definitely still be in your life. She's family now." After Ethan had been settled with breakfast and cartoons, we resumed our planning with renewed purpose. I would meet with Gloria that afternoon. She had agreed to a meeting at her nursing home after receiving my carefully worded message explaining that it concerned both of her twin daughters and potential legal issues that might affect her. Lucy and Sophie would head to the federal building to meet with prosecutors, providing formal statements about Laura's role in the identity theft scheme and the subsequent threats. Richard would stay home with Ethan, maintaining normalcy as much as possible, while coordinating with our lawyer about the divorce proceedings, which had taken on new urgency and complexity given Laura's criminal entanglements. Oakwood Retirement Village belied its institutional purpose with landscaped grounds and a lobby that resembled an upscale hotel more than a care facility. Gloria Davis had a private suite on the 3rd floor overlooking a small ornamental lake where residents could feed the ducks from benches along a paved pathway. At 72, Gloria retained a dignified beauty that immediately explained the striking features her daughters had inherited. Silver hair was styled in a classic bob, Her posture remained erect, despite the walker positioned near her armchair, and her eyes the same deep brown as Sophie's, and Laura's were clear and evaluating as I entered her suite. "You're not from the facility staff." Her voice held the faint traces of a southern accent softened by decades in the Midwest. "And you're too old to be selling anything door to door." The directness startled a genuine laugh from me, easing some of the tension I'd carried into the meeting. "You're right on both counts. I'm Margaret Thompson, and I'm here about your daughters, Sophie and Laura." Gloria's expression remained neutral, but her hands folded neatly in her lap tightened visibly at the names. "What about them? I haven't seen Laura in over a year. And I've never met Sophie." The confirmation that Laura had maintained contact with Gloria while keeping Sophie in the dark about their birth mother's existence added yet another layer to her duplicity. I chose my next words carefully, aware that I was about to shatter whatever narrative Laura had constructed for her biological mother. "I'm Richard's mother, Laura's mother-in-law. Or I was. The situation has changed dramatically in recent weeks." Over the next 20 minutes, I outlined the essentials of what we had discovered: the twins' reunion, Laura's manipulation of Sophie as an identity, double the connection to Collins and the financial fraud scheme, and finally the current legal proceedings and threats. Throughout my explanation, Gloria remained still, her expression giving away nothing beyond an occasional tightening of her lips or narrowing of her eyes. When I finished, she was silent for several long moments, gazing out at the lake where an elderly man in a sweater vest was tossing breadcrumbs to a cluster of eager ducks. Finally, she turned back to me, her voice level, but underlaid with a current of deep emotion. "I gave birth to identical twin girls 35 years ago. My husband, their father, was a controlling man with expensive tastes and limited income. When the doctor announced twins, Harold flew into a rage right there in the delivery room. Claimed we couldn't afford 2 babies that I'd trapped him, that one had to go." Gloria paused, her gaze unfocused as she revisited that traumatic day. I was weak from a difficult labor, terrified of Harold's temper. The nurses took the second baby away. They told me later she'd been placed with a good family, a nurse who couldn't have children. I named the one I kept Laura after my grandmother. Her account aligned with Mrs. Felicity's story, filling in the missing pieces from the other perspective. But it didn't explain Laura's subsequent behavior or why she had maintained contact with Gloria while keeping Sophie ignorant of their shared heritage. As if anticipating my questions, Gloria continued. "Harold left us when Laura was 8, cleaned out our bank accounts, and disappeared. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Laura barely saw me, practically raised herself. She was always resourceful, found ways to get what she wanted from people." The diplomatic phrasing suggested a pattern of manipulation that had begun in childhood, an adaptive strategy for a girl essentially abandoned by her father and largely unsupervised by her overworked mother. When Laura was in college, I received an unexpected inheritance from a great uncle who'd invested early in Chicago real estate. Nothing extravagant, but enough to provide security. I set up a trust fund for Laura, paid for her education. Then 5 years ago, I had a stroke. The doctor said another could happen any time. I updated my will to provide for both daughters. I'd never stopped searching for Sophie, hired investigators over the years. Gloria's hands twisted in her lap, the only visible sign of her inner turmoil. Somehow Laura found out about the provision for her twin. She was displeased. Said I was diluting her inheritance to benefit a stranger. That's when she started asking questions about Sophie's adoption, the hospital records, any details I could remember. The timing aligned with Sophie's account of when Laura had first approached her at the farmer's market 3 years ago, shortly after Gloria had revised her will to include the daughter she'd been forced to give up. Did Laura know that Sophie was unaware of their relationship? That Sophie had no idea you were searching for her? Gloria nodded slowly, the admission clearly painful. She told me Sophie wasn't ready for a reunion, that she needed time to process the discovery of a twin. Said she was acting as an intermediary, preparing Sophie gradually for meeting me. I believed her because I wanted to, because the alternative was accepting that my daughter was deliberately keeping us apart for her own benefit. The depth of Laura's deception, extending even to her own birth mother, was breathtaking in its callousness. She had effectively isolated both women from each other, controlling the flow of information to maintain her advantage. How substantial is this inheritance? I asked, needing to understand the financial motivation underlying Laura's schemes. Gloria's smile held no humor. The properties have appreciated significantly over the decades. The total estate is valued at approximately $12 million, split equally between my daughters upon my death. If one predeceases me, the other receives the full amount. The revelation illuminated a darker dimension to Laura's manipulations. Beyond the identity theft scheme with Collins, she might have been positioning herself to eliminate Sophie entirely from the inheritance equation, either by legal means, having her declared dead after disappearing, or through more sinister methods using Collins' dangerous connections. I believe Laura may have been planning something beyond financial fraud, I said carefully. Something that would ensure she became your sole heir. Gloria closed her eyes briefly, pain etching deeper lines around her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I've spent decades trying to make amends for giving up one daughter under duress. Now I learn the one I kept might have been planning to harm her sister. Where did I go wrong with her? The question held echoes of Richard's earlier anguish about explaining the situation to Ethan. Both parents were grappling with the same fundamental doubt: had they somehow created or enabled the damage in Laura? Could they have prevented it with different choices? Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that we can't control how our children turn out. We can provide love guidance opportunities, but their choices remain their own. Parenting offers no guarantees, only possibilities. Gloria studied me for a long moment, perhaps recognizing a fellow traveler on the difficult road of motherhood. Then she reached for her walker, pulling herself upright with surprising strength. I need to meet Sophie, today if possible, and I need to change my will immediately to protect her. If Laura thinks she can wait me out for the inheritance she needs, to understand that option is off the table. The determination in her voice reminded me of Sophie's growing resilience in the face of Laura's threats, a shared genetic strength that had expressed itself differently in each woman based on their life experiences. Where Laura had channeled her resourcefulness into deception and manipulation, Sophie and Gloria were finding their way toward principled resolve. Within hours, we had arranged for Sophie to meet Gloria at the retirement village under the protective watch of an FBI agent Eleanor had assigned to the case. The reunion was private, a moment too intimate and fragile for outsiders to witness. But when they emerged from Gloria's suite 2 hours later, both women's eyes were reddened from tears, and they held hands with the careful wonder of those discovering a connection long thought lost. Sophie's face glowed with a new certainty, as if a crucial piece of her identity had finally clicked into place. She looks like my mother, my real mother. All these years I thought I was alone except for my adoptive parents, but I had family looking for me. Gloria's transformation was equally profound. The reserved, dignified woman I'd met earlier had softened her movements more animated as she kept reaching out to touch Sophie's hand or face, as if reassuring herself that her long-lost daughter was truly present. We're going to fix this, all of it, Gloria announced as we prepared to leave. I've called my attorney. We're setting up a separate trust for Sophie that activates immediately, not upon my death. And I'm providing a sworn statement about Laura's behavior, her knowledge of my will, and the timing of her sudden interest in finding her sister. The decisive action marked a turning point in our approach to the situation. Rather than merely reacting to Laura's moves or cooperating with authorities, we were now actively building a case that connected all aspects of her deception, from the personal betrayal of Richard and Ethan, to the financial fraud with Collins, to the manipulation of her own birth mother and sister for inheritance purposes. News of Collins's arrest had apparently reached international dimensions, as evidenced by the text message Richard received that evening from an unknown number. Laura in Paris. Not coming back? Deal with C collapsed. She's toxic now. The cryptic message, likely from one of Collins's business associates distancing themselves from the scandal, confirmed what we had suspected. Laura had fled the country, probably using one of several false identities created through the scheme with Collins. Though beyond immediate reach of American authorities, her escape effectively ended any remaining threat to our family. She was now a fugitive, her resources dwindling as Collins' assets were frozen and his network disintegrated under federal scrutiny. The weeks that followed brought a strange mixture of legal proceedings and emotional healing. Richard filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and fraud, a process simplified by Laura's absence and the overwhelming evidence of her deceptions. Ethan began sessions with a child psychologist specializing in family trauma, working through his confused feelings about the mother who had essentially abandoned him and the nice mommy who had unexpectedly become his aunt. Sophie secured a better-paying job with regular hours, allowing her to visit more frequently. She became a steady presence in our home, helping with Ethan's homework, joining us for Sunday dinners, gradually finding her place in the family constellation, not as Laura's replacement, but as her own person, warmer, more genuine, unburdened by the constant calculation that had characterized her twin. Gloria, too, became part of our extended circle, visiting when her health permitted, and developing a particularly tender relationship with Ethan, who delighted in having a great-grandmother who shared his love of birdwatching and chocolate ice cream. The connection seemed healing for both of them, Gloria finding joy in the grandchild she'd nearly missed knowing, and Ethan gaining a family member whose love was straightforward and reliable. 3 months after Laura's disappearance, on a crisp autumn evening with leaves crunching underfoot and pumpkins adorning neighborhood porches, I sat on the back patio watching Richard and Sophie work together in the garden. They were planting tulip bulbs for spring, their heads bent close as Richard demonstrated the proper depth for each planting hole. The air between them held a tentative warmth that had been developing gradually, not romance yet, but perhaps its foundation mutual respect, shared experiences, genuine care for Ethan. Lucy joined me on the patio, bringing mugs of hot cider spiced with cinnamon. "They look good together," she observed, nodding toward the pair in the garden. "Natural." I sipped my cider non-committal, but privately agreeing. After Laura's calculated performance of perfection, Sophie's genuine nature, sometimes awkward, occasionally insecure, but always honest, had become a balm for our wounded family. Richard seemed drawn to her authenticity, to the woman who had chosen truth even when lies might have been easier or more profitable. "Richard deserves someone real," I said finally, "and Ethan needs stability. But they both need time to heal first." Lucy nodded, understanding the caution underlying my words. The betrayal had left deep scars on Richard, not just the pain of infidelity, but the more profound wound of realizing his entire marriage had been a tactical move in a complex fraud scheme. His trust had been so fundamentally violated that rebuilding it would require patience and deliberate care. As if summoned by our conversation, Ethan burst onto the patio, clutching a drawing he'd made at school. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a house, a tall man labeled Dad, a smaller figure labeled Me, a woman with a triangle dress labeled Auntie Sophie, and an older figure with gray hair labeled Grandma. Above them all, a yellow sun beamed down its rays, extending across the page. "Look what I made in art class." Ethan's face shone with pride as he presented his work. "Ms. Johnson said to draw our family." Richard and Sophie had come in from the garden, drawn by Ethan's excited voice. They stood side by side, viewing the drawing with matching expressions of surprised tenderness. Without comment, Richard placed his hand lightly on Sophie's shoulder, a gesture of inclusion, acknowledgement, possibility. "That's beautiful, buddy," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's exactly right." Ethan beamed, then ran inside to find tape for hanging his masterpiece on the refrigerator. In his wake, the 4 adults exchanged glances filled with unspoken understanding. Whatever form our family ultimately took, it would be built on truth rather than deception, on genuine connection rather than calculated advantage. A week later, Richard asked Sophie to join him for dinner, just the 2 of them, a tentative first step toward exploring what might exist between them beyond their shared history with Laura. I watched them leave, Richard holding the door for Sophie with an old-fashioned courtesy that reminded me of Robert Sophie's nervous smile illuminated by the porch light. They returned 3 hours later, their expressions soft and slightly wondering, like people who had discovered an unexpected path through familiar territory. Neither said much about the evening, but the careful way Richard helped Sophie with her coat and the lingering touch of her hand on his arm spoke volumes about newly awakened possibilities. Over the following months, their relationship developed with deliberate slowness: movie nights after Ethan was asleep, coffee dates between Sophie's shifts at her new job, long walks around the neighborhood where they talked about everything and nothing. Richard was rebuilding his capacity for trust, one careful brick at a time. Sophie was discovering her worth as a woman valued for herself, not as a stand-in or a tool for someone else's agenda. On a snowy evening in December, 6 months after Laura's dramatic departure from our lives, Richard invited Sophie to the living room after Ethan had gone to bed. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner, wrapped presents nestled beneath its branches. Richard had been uncharacteristically nervous all day, checking his pocket repeatedly, as if confirming something was still there. Sophie sat on the couch, smoothing her simple blue dress. Nothing like the designer outfits Laura had favored, but perfectly suited to Sophie's natural beauty and unpretentious nature. Richard knelt before her, taking her hands in his with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes as I watched from the doorway. "Sophie, I don't want to waste any more time. You brought light back into my life and Ethan's when we were in darkness. Would you consider becoming my wife and Ethan's mother?" He opened a small velvet box containing a modest diamond ring, nothing ostentatious but elegant in its simplicity. Sophie stared at it, tears spilling down her cheeks, then looked up at me standing in the doorway as if seeking permission or blessing. I stepped forward, taking her trembling hand in mine. "You deserve this happiness, my dear. You've been part of this family in truth for a long time now." Sophie threw her arms around Richard, her joyful yes muffled against his shoulder. He held her tightly, his eyes closing in profound relief and happiness. Over Sophie's shoulder he mouthed a silent thank you, to me acknowledgement of the journey we had traveled together through betrayal and pain, to reach this moment of new beginning. Their wedding 2 months later was nothing like the elaborate social affair Laura had orchestrated for her marriage to Richard. Sophie and Richard exchanged vows in our backyard snow still coating the fence posts, red roses tied with white ribbons providing the only decoration. Ethan stood proudly beside his father, as best man, his small suit jacket slightly too big in the shoulders. Joseph flew in from a business trip abroad to stand with his brother, his smile as bright as the day he'd first earned his pilot's wings. I sat in the front row wearing a silk dress in deep blue that I'd purchased specially for the occasion, the first time I'd publicly embraced the financial comfort I'd built for myself over decades of careful investment. As Sophie walked toward Richard on Gloria's arm, both women radiant with a joy that transformed them, I felt Robert's presence beside me as surely as if he'd occupied the empty chair I'd saved in his memory. "Look at our son," I whispered to him in my thoughts. "Look at what he's overcome, how he's chosen love and truth over bitterness and defeat." After the ceremony, as guests mingled in our living room warmed by a crackling fire, Gloria pulled me aside, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I spent 35 years regretting the daughter I gave up," she confessed. "Now I realize that loss brought Sophie back to us in the end, brought her to Richard, to Ethan, to this family that values her as Laura never did." I squeezed her hand in understanding. The human heart has an infinite capacity for finding meaning in suffering, for extracting purpose from pain. It's what allows us to survive our darkest moments, the belief that something valuable might emerge from our greatest losses. As evening fell and the celebration continued around us, I stepped onto the porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The winter air was crisp, and clean stars emerging in the darkening sky above. From inside came the sound of Ethan's laughter, mingled with Joseph's deeper voice, the gentle notes of a piano someone had begun to play, the murmur of conversation among friends who had weathered the storm with us. Sophie appeared in the doorway, now changed from her wedding dress into a simpler outfit for the evening. She joined me at the railing, her new ring catching the light as she rested her hands on the weathered wood. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she admitted softly. "When I was growing up, I always felt something was missing, some piece of myself I couldn't identify. I thought meeting Laura would fill that void, but it just created more emptiness. It wasn't until I found all of you a real family that I finally felt whole." I slipped my arm around her waist, drawing her close as a daughter. Sometimes the families we create matter more than the ones we're born into. What binds us isn't just blood or legal documents, it's the choice we make every day to love each other through all of life's complexities. Sophie smiled, resting her head briefly on my shoulder before we both turned back toward the warm light spilling from the doorway, illuminating the path home to where Richard waited, where Ethan's innocent joy reminded us of life's capacity for renewal, where the future stretched before us, not as a continuation of the past, but as something new and precious. We were building together one truth at a time,